Hi everybody, and thank you for joining me again on another episode of Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at one of the more unusual lights that's coming here for review. This is the NANLITE Alien 300C. This is an RGBWW fixture with a CCT range from 2700 Kelvin up to 12,000 Kelvin with green and magenta correction. It has a separate control box with built-in power supply, a large full-color screen, and V-mount battery receivers built onto the side. It also has built-in CRMX 8 and 16-bit profiles and all of the color modes that you would expect from an RGBWW light. It has a pop-out softbox design, which is also very easily removable. And its LEDs are a native 60-degree spot encased in a clear gasket weather protection, which gives the head an IP55 rating. Let's start off with the usual disclaimer. NANLITE are not paying me any money for this review. However, they did send me the product for free and I do get to keep it or sell it after the review is completed. So that is technically a payment because I'm receiving goods, and that could possibly on some level affect my opinion, and that is something you need to be aware of as a viewer. So the first thing I thought when I saw this product was, why on earth would I buy this over a Pavoslim? I mean, the Pavoslim head is way lighter. Well, there's two very good reasons. Number one is firepower. This thing is 300 watt, whereas a Pavoslim in a similar size is only 120 watt. And the second reason is the CCT range. A Pavoslim tops out at 7,500 Kelvin, whereas the Alien goes all the way up to 12,000 Kelvin. Now, if you're working in a studio environment, another possible reason for picking these over the Pavoslims is the DMX connectors. This has real 5-pin XLR connectors, whereas the Pavoslim uses the mini jack and you have to have this irritating adapter cable. So I want to talk about the design of this light because it is a little bit unusual. So you've got 60-degree LEDs which are encased behind this plastic cover, giving the head an IP55 rating. Now, it's important to note that the controller doesn't have an IP rating, but it is supplied with a jacket to give it some weather protection. Now, the back of this reminds me of my 1x1 hards because the electronics and the cooling fans are built in a separate section on the back to the LED and the heatsink. So that's quite unusual. But the thing we really need to talk about so that everybody understands is the softbox that mounts onto the front. Now, the pop-out softbox doesn't really make the light any softer because it hasn't increased the size of the light source. So what is the job of this softbox? Well, remember how the LEDs are a native spot, 60 degrees. So if you want to put a diffusion in front of this and have the diffusion work really well, you're going to need to have it spaced further away from the LEDs than just dropping it in the front like you would with flood LEDs. And that is the purpose of the softbox. Now, these shots are with the light at a distance of 1 meter away from the wall. This is with the full diffusion. This is with the grid cloth diffusion. And this is with no diffusion. So your diffusers in combination with the softbox are pretty much your tool for changing your beam angle. And this is the difference if you're lighting up a larger area. This is with the full diffusion, with the grid cloth diffusion, and with no diffusion. Now let's get into my list of negatives. In my opinion, if you're going to make a light that's weather protected, you should make the controller weather protected as well. That way there's going to be no confusion. The next possible negative is the controller does have a 48 volt input, but it's not an industry standard connection like 3-pin XLR. The supplied head lead is only 3 meters long. Now you can buy some optional bundles for this and it is sold with a crate, but apart from those two things, there's no real accessories for this product. Now let's get into my list of pros. The head does have an IP55 rating. It's got cooling fans, but they do run really quiet. It's got built-in CRMX. The user interface really is superb. It's got very good color rendering scores, and at 3200 Kelvin, this light has the best dimming results of any light that I've ever tested on Gaffer and Gear. Another pro for this light is its ability to run off V-mount batteries. which can connect directly to the sides. Now, if a brightness limitation is in play because of the battery that you've got connected, then you'll see a line displaying a physical hard limit on the brightness slider. And if you try to go above that, it will explain to you that you're limited due to your battery. Running off a single 14.4 or 14.8 volt battery, you've got a brightness limitation of 45%. Running off a single 26 volt battery, you've got a brightness limitation of 75%. Running off any voltage combination of V-mount batteries, you can run the light at 100% brightness. Now let's go through cost and what you get for your money. So just some prices I found online today. In the US, it seems to be selling for about $1,500 US, and in Australia, it's selling for about $2,600. Now, for that money, you get a case, the light, the controller, and the stand clamp all pack into the bottom, and your power cable, your head lead cable, the second diffuser for your softbox, the control grid for the softbox, and the weather jacket for the controller all go into the top. All right, let's go through the top of the bag first. The head lead. So the head lead is only 3 meters long. That's probably the most disappointing thing about it, but it does have really good quality connectors. Of course, you get a power cable, which has a Nutrix connector, and it's made of PVC. Also in the bag is the grid cloth diffuser for the softbox. The full diffuser is already attached to the softbox, which is attached to the light. And in this bag is the weather protector for the controller. Now you also get a control grid for the softbox. Now this is a mixture of a spine on the top and bottom and soft sides, and all of the cells are sewn together. Of course you get the controller. Let's take a closer look at this. On the top of the controller you've got a carry handle, and underneath that you've got all of your inputs and outputs. You've got your output for the light, you've got a 48 volt DC input, you've got your Nutrix connector input for the light, you've got your DMX in and out, which is 5-pin XLR, and your power on off switch. On either side of the controller, you've got V-mount plates for running off batteries, and on the back, you've got a connection for the stand mount. Of course, you also get a stand mount, and the last thing of note in the kit is the light. Okay, let's take a closer look at this. The softbox has elastic straps that go around these studs on the back of the light. The outside chassis of the light looks like it's made of plastic, but if you give it a tap, it's clearly metallic. The corners of the light are reinforced, and the front of each corner has a threaded mount for attaching optional barn doors. But you can mount a spigot into this spot. The back has a separate compartment with the cooling fans and the electronics in it, which is elevated away from the shell, which contains the LEDs and the heatsink. Its tilt has a single clutch lock. The stirrup is made of metal. However, the connection point between the stand receiver and the stirrup is made of plastic, but it does seem pretty solid. And its LEDs are a native 60-degree spot encased in a clear gasket weather protection, which gives the head an IP55 rating. Okay, let's take a look through the user interface. You've got a full color display, which is quite large, so you don't need to squint to read it. You've got your 4 buttons, mode, menu, preset, and keypad lock, which will glow blue if you have them selected. And you've got 3 combination button and knobs underneath, which is really handy because most of our light modes have 3 parameters of adjustment. Now at any stage, you can press down the lock button, hold it for a few seconds, and it will keypad lock the screen out. You are left in no doubt that the user interface is locked. The lock button is now blue, and you've got 2 padlock symbols. To unlock, just hold the button down for an extended period of time. Now, regardless of the mode that you're working in, you can use the preset button to save your parameters. Preset is where you can save and recall up to 20 settings. Let's take a look at the modes. We've got CCT, HSI, RGBWW, XY, we've got a gels library and a special effects library. To scroll between your selections, use the right knob. To make your selection, press the knob. Let's have a look at our CCT mode. We've got 3 parameters of adjustment and we've got 3 knobs to do the adjustment. The knob on your left is your brightness adjuster. Now you can select in the menu what increments of adjustment that works to. You can also press the button to toggle between on and off. The center knob tunes your CCT. You've got 2700 up to 12,000 Kelvin. If you press the button, it'll skip to presets. And your final parameter of adjustment is green and magenta. This works to delta UV scale. If at any time you want to return to neutral, press the button. Now let's take a look at the HSI mode. Again, you've got 3 parameters of adjustment and 3 knobs. The left knob is your brightness. The center knob selects your color hue. And the right knob is your saturation. Now you can't select the white point at which you're desaturating to, but you can over DMX operation. Pressing the knobs will select presets. Now the RGBWW mode is pretty straightforward, so there's no point really covering that. We have an XY coordinate mode. Now just to note, the XY coordinate mode is very slow for adjustments. The next mode of operation is the gels library. Again, the left knob selects your brightness, and the center knob selects whether you're applying the gel to 3200 or a 5600 base CCT. And the right knob selects your gel. The next mode of operation is your special effects, and we've got loads to choose from. Now, I'm not going to go through these modes in case somebody is photoepileptic, but let's just take a quick look at fire. You can select your CCT, your green magenta, and you can change the speed at which the effect happens. You can also select flicker on and off. Now, in my opinion, the fire effect is very jerky and doesn't really look like fire to me. All right, let's take a look now in the menu. And the first option is light control. You can select your output between maximum brightness and constant, but what I really like is you can select your dimming increments. Here we can select a dim in 0.1% increments. Here's something I like, 0.1 below 10%, because quite often we only really need that fine-tune adjustment below 10, and the rest of the time we'd like to select quickly, and the default is 1% increment adjustments. Next thing in the menu is your DMX and address settings. You can select your DMX address. The next thing in the menu is your DMX modes. And as you can see, this light has plenty of modes in both 8 and 16-bit. You can also select whether you have reduced channels on, so that gives you all of the above modes, plus options like turning the fans on and off remotely. You got your DMX smoothing on and off. I'd recommend having the smoothing on. You can select the dimmer curve, and we have quite a few options here. You have options for what to do if we lose a connection, and that's the DMX menu completed. Next is our wireless control menu. And we've got our settings for Bluetooth, 2.4G, Lumen radio settings, and we can turn all of our wireless off at the same time. Now it's worth noting that no matter where you are in the user interface, on the bottom of the screen is an indication of what wireless modes are turned on and turned off. Next thing in the menu is your display settings. You can select your screen brightness, rotate the screen, and you can select whether the buttons are backlit or not. Next in the menu is fixture settings. Here you can select your fan mode, firmware update, you can do a master reset. Fixture info is basically just the version number. And if you find this user interface not to be a challenge, you can always change the language. Let's take a look at the light with the softbox and the full diffusion attached. And as you would expect, it has a very wide even beam. The characteristics are the same regardless of the CCT or the color that you dial in. And the shadows are what I would expect from a panel light of this size. Now let's take a look at the light with the half grid cloth, and we have a substantial increase in brightness. Now the beam is definitely not as even. You could make the argument that this has the same beam angle as the previous diffuser, but it just has a very big hotspot. Or you could make the argument that it has a tighter beam angle with a lot more drop off. Either way, the results are the same regardless of the CCT or the colour that you dial in. In terms of the shadows, there's enough density in this diffuser that you don't get multiple shadows off the individual LEDs. Now let's take a look at the light with no diffusion attached, and we have a substantial increase in brightness with a smaller beam angle. Now you could use the drop-off on the edge of this quite creatively, because unlike some other lensed spot panels, this has consistent colour quality right across the beam. In terms of the shadows, the closer you are to the light, the more multiple shadows you get, and the further away you are from the light, the more singular the shadow. Now let's have a look through the DMX. When this light receives a DMX command, it switches over to a DMX homepage. This homepage has all the information that you would need to know. You've got your address, the mode at which you're set to, the DMX footprint, that's how many channels it takes, whether the reduce mode is turned on or off, what your dimmer curve is set to, your smoothing settings, and your loss of behavior commands. Now on the bottom half of the screen, it actually displays the parameter inputs that are being sent to the light. So for example, as my CCT changes, the numbers change on the screen as well. Okay, let's start the DMX testing. The NANLITE Alien is receiving its commands via its internal CRMX receiver. It is set to a 16-bit CCT HSI crossover profile, and it currently has its smoothing turned on. To give you something to compare the response times to, I have a Skypanel S60C. The Skypanel is also set to a 16-bit CCT HSI crossover profile, and is receiving its commands via an external CRMX receiver. Both lights are receiving their commands at the same time. Both lights are being controlled via blackout software, and I'm using a Cerise transmitter. Let's start off with instant on-off commands. Now we're going to do the same test again, but this time with the smoothing turned off on the Alien. Now the smoothing is turned on, let's have a look at some half-second cues. And now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. Now for some 5-second cues. Now I'm just going to enter some random brightness inputs. Again, both lights are receiving the same commands at the same time. Now let's have a look at some CCT changes between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. And again, the smoothing is turned on. Now let's take a look at some half-second changeovers. Now let's take a look at some 1-second changeovers. Now for some 2.5-second changeovers. And some 5-second changeovers. Now let's have a look at some cues, switching between white light and a color hue, starting with instant changeovers. Now let's do that exact test again, but this time with the smoothing turned off. Now the smoothing's turned back on, let's do some half-second transitions. Now some 1-second transitions. Now for some 2.5-second transitions. And now for some 5-second transitions. Now I'm going to do a sweep of all the color vectors over 30 seconds, starting now. The maximum power draw, automatically recorded over several days of testing, was 383.7 watt. At 3200 Kelvin I recorded 330 watt, and at 5600 Kelvin I recorded 324 watt. And the power factor unity scores as you're dimming are more than reasonable, so you won't have any problem running this light off a small generator or a battery inverter system. Now let's take a look at the dimming. According to my frequency meter, this light is running at 20 kHz pulse width modulation. This came as a surprise because most NANLUX and NANLITE equipment uses analog dimming. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 3200 Kelvin. And these are the best dimming results I've ever recorded on Gaffer and gear. I've taken readings at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5% and 1%. Compared to the brightness reading at 100%, 75% came in at 71, 50% came in at 47, 25% came in at 24%, 10%, 5% and 1% were all smack on. Now, not only does the CCT have minimal variation, it always stays incredibly close to the target value. The TM30 color render score does drop from a 95 down to a 94 between 50 and 25%, and the delta UV or white placement stays almost perfect throughout the entire dimming range. Now let's take a look at 5600 Kelvin. The dimming ratio is close enough to perfect for me. There is a little bit of variation in the CCT, but it is pretty consistent. The TM30 color render score does drop from a 95 down to a 94, somewhere between 25 and 10%, and the white point placement, delta UV or green magenta shift is very consistent. Now let's take a look at the average CCT accuracy. I took readings at every Kelvin between 2700 and 7000. The light is always above the target value, and as you can see, the higher the target value, the more the light is out by. Now let's take a look at color render measured in TM30RF. I took readings at every Kelvin between 2700 and 7000, and this light's super impressive. Below 3200 Kelvin it scores a 96, and above 3200 Kelvin it's scoring 95. Now let's take a look at our white point placement or delta UV. Now this light tracks very consistently to the Planckian curve until it gets to 5600 Kelvin, where it does jump up to an average of plus 0.0012. That places it somewhere between the daylight and the Planckian curve, so this might have been intentional. Here's a quick snapshot of the higher Kelvins between 8000 and 12,000, taken at 1000 Kelvin increments. Now let's take a closer look at our more commonly used Kelvins with the softbox and the full diffuser attached. Then after that, we'll take a look at the light with no diffuser across a broader range of CCTs. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin with the full diffusion, I got 3101 with an SSI score of 86. The TM30 color testing results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R11 was below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point placement was almost perfect with a delta UV of plus 0.0004. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin with the full diffusion through the softbox, I got 4295. The TM30 color testing results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 103% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9, R11 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0015. So if you work into the Planckian curve or blackbody curve, that would give this light an ever so slight green hue to roughly the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin through the softbox with the full diffusion, I got 5386 with an SSI score of 76. The TM30 color testing results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 103% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R11 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0018. So if you work into the Planckian curve, this light would have a barely imperceivable green hue to roughly the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. And if you work into the daylight curve, then the light will have a magenta hue to roughly about 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's take a closer look at some of the Kelvins with no modifier attached. Now I just want to explain the top CCT is 12,000 Kelvin, but I've also taken a reading at 10,000 Kelvin because the light performs better at 10,000 than it does at 12. But anyway, let's take a look first off at the lowest CCT we can dial in, which is 2700. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2720. The TM30 color testing results were 96% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R9 is below 90. The spectrum distribution is really healthy, And the white point is almost perfect with a delta UV of minus 0.0001. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3213 with an SSI score of 86. The TN30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R11 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And again, the white point is almost perfect with a delta UV of plus 0.0001. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4528. The TN30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 104% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9, R11 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was very accurate with a delta UV of plus 0.0007. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5796 with an SSI score of 75. The TN30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 104% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9, R11 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0013. So if you're working to the Plain-King curve, this will be imperceivably green to roughly the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. And if you're working to the daylight curve, then this will be slightly magenta to roughly the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 magenta correction gel. When I dialed in 10,000 Kelvin, I got 10,275. The TN30 colour testing results were 93% average colour accuracy with an average 99% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the light is still tracking beautifully to the Plain-King curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0008. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 12,000, I got 12,680. The TN30 colour testing results were 91% average colour accuracy with an average 99% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the light is still tracking beautifully to the Plain-King curve with a delta UV of only plus 0.0007. Now let's take a look at how accurately this light dials in its primary and secondary colour vectors. 0 degrees or 360 degrees, which should be red, came in at 1 degree. Green was smack on at 120 degrees. Blue was smack on at 240 degrees. Yellow, which in theory should be 60 degrees, came in at 41, but it actually does look yellow. Cyan, which should be 180 degrees, was a long way off at 231 degrees. And magenta, which should be 300 degrees, was also a fair way off at 258. Now, just my closing thoughts. I think where this light really heroes is its ability to point directly up into the rain because of this clear gasket weather protection design that it's got. The only other light that I can think of that can do this is the cream source vortex. So quite possibly this might be worth considering as a poor man's vortex. Maybe you don't have enough money to buy additional vortexes to put in the background in the rain. This could be a viable alternative to a vortex in that regard. Now, I'll give you an idea of what I mean by we don't have a lot of lights that can point directly upwards into the rain. Let's take a COB light that has a weather protection rating on it, okay? If you point that directly up into the rain and you've got it running at full power and a drop of cold rain hits the safety glass, it can crack, whereas that's not going to be a problem with these. Now, for me personally, that's not a scenario that I use these lights in. So I only really use this sort of heavier panel light design if I want to light up something like a chroma key wall or a cyc wall. And this can do that, but only in conjunction with its heavy diffuser. So in that scenario, this does suck up a lot of light, and this comes in at about half the brightness of a native 300 watt floodlight panel. So for me personally, it's a no, but if you need that weather protection, particularly if you're pointing directly up into the rain, this could definitely be the solution that you're looking for.